Hello, happy Monday. Welcome back to another episode of Monday Science. Greetings from my office. I had a grant deadline, I submitted it, and I wanted to make sure that I rewarded myself with recording the intro for today's episode. How have you been? How's your week been? In case you have not seen Monday Science, did I mention this last week? I actually can't remember, but Monday Science was listed on Amazon Music's Best Podcast of the Week list. I think I did say this last week, but you can tell I'm buzzed. I really just want to say thank you to Amazon Music for the recognition and welcome new Amazon Music listeners. Welcome to Monday Science. Today is the concluding episode of my interview with Dr. Douglas Zytko, and we talk a lot about consent and what that means in the metaverse. So, trigger warning, we are having conversations around sexual assault, sexual harassment, consent in general. Let me know what you think of the episode. You can, if you're listening to this on Spotify, you can actually answer the Q&A poll. Otherwise, send me an email, info@mondaysciencepodcast.com. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Take care. Bye.
Science. Technology. Medicine. Health. These four things make the world go round. Without them, we couldn't exist. This is the Monday Science Podcast, a weekly show bringing you the latest research and news in science, technology, medicine, and health, answering your questions or finding experts in the field to answer them. Your host is a pharmacist, an award-winning scientist. She leads her own research group and is the founder of King's College London Fight the Fakes. A tad bit on the qualified side. Welcome to Monday Science. Here's your host, Dr. Bahija Raimi-Abraham.
How do you set boundaries in a virtual space? What does consent look like in a virtual space?
Let's talk about some terms here. So we've mentioned the term consent a few different times, which has a lot of different interpretations in the public world. And so when we're talking about consent, at least when I'm talking about consent, what I'm really talking about is agreement to a particular interaction or a particular behavior occurring different interaction. So consent is often talked about in a sexual lens, where giving agreement to a particular sexual act occurring. When we talk about that in VR, we can extrapolate the term to really any kind of interaction or experience. How are users giving agreement to an interaction? The reason I emphasize consent is because of how I define harm in the metaverse and how I define harm in VR dating. So I define harm as an experience that occurs without prior consent or agreement of the victim. That's it. It's a very subjective term. So I'm not defining harm by particular behaviors because there's so much subjectivity in what kind of behaviors users consider normal, acceptable, or even desirable. So my definition of harm places that defining role in the hands of the recipient of the behavior. Have they consented or agreed to that experience or not? That's how I define harm. So when it comes to VR, the reason I'm very excited about VR, which might not sound that way so far because I'm talking so much about harms that can occur in VR and then into these AR facilitated dates, the reason I'm really excited about VR is because every aspect of interaction between users can be designed for, including consent. And so before VR came along, and if you look at the consent literature and how professionals recommend that consent should happen, we see this term affirmative consent, which is this notion of yes means yes, meaning that you must get an explicit yes or an explicit agreement from a partner before you engage in a sexual act. It's not the responsibility of the recipient to overtly refuse an act. It's the responsibility of the initiator to get that agreement. And there's been some pushback to affirmative consent through the years on the grounds that it's just not practical or feasible to carry out with every single interaction we have, particularly every single sexual interaction. Are we supposed to stop after I touch? Is it okay if I touch your arm? Is it okay? Did I touch your leg? Can I now kiss you? And while we totally understand why that kind of behavior would minimize the chance of sexual violence through misinterpretation of that agreement, it also feels somewhat socially awkward. But then when we look at VR, there are capabilities in which we can carry out this yes means yes principle in ways that are a lot less annoying or obtrusive to users, and in ways that can enrich the experience in a very positive way. And so in the research that my team has been doing over the last year, we practice this method that we call participatory design. And all that really means is you involve anticipated users of a technology in the design of the technology. So where this differs from more classic UX design or UX research methods like usability testing is you as the professional are not creating a prototype and then asking your users to react to it. You're having your anticipated users do the design and decision making themselves. And so last year, we conducted a participatory design study with individuals that align with the anticipated demographics of VR dating to understand how should these applications be designed for safety. And the overarching theme of their design concepts was consent or agreement to behavior. And they delineated consent along 3 dimensions. One was, how can we design to facilitate the actual giving and receiving of consent to interaction with another person? That's one. 2 is, how can we design to inform users' consent decisions? So, okay, maybe I can give consent to this person to interact with me, but is that the right decision? Have they harmed someone before and they might harm me? That's 2. 3rd is informing decisions to consent to observing interaction of others. So in VR dating in particular, if we can anticipate some users might be engaging in cybersexual acts or displaying sexual imagery, how can we inform users' decisions to overtly agree to observing or experiencing that content before they're exposed to it? So those 3 dimensions. I do have to say, unfortunately, that VR dating applications and even general purpose social VR applications are not currently well designed for consent intentionally. Users might be co-opting their designs for consent exchange purposes, but we're not seeing explicit design patterns or structures for consent exchange. So let's give some examples of the ideas that our participants have been giving us. And I will preface this by saying that this is absolutely still work in progress. So we do have a journal paper coming out within the next couple months precisely on this work. That's not the end of the project. What we're currently working on now is building out fully functional prototypes of what we would call consent mechanics with women and LGBTQ plus users to understand how they anticipate interacting with these consent mechanics. But this is what we know so far. So what we know so far is along those 3 types of consent, there are fairly popular design suggestions that we've gotten from users that a lot of them agree with. In terms of giving consent to interaction, there's two design concepts that our participants have been really championing. One, I would call it, our participants have called it social settings. We might call it pre-consent settings. So this refers to the capacity for users to pre-identify to the application what types of applications they have pre-consented to, meaning you don't need to ask me for my explicit agreement for someone to come up to me and say things to me. Or you don't have to ask my permission for a user to maybe touch my avatar. So these more general, broad types of interactions that users are confident or comfortable enough to say, I'm okay with these happening without my explicit consent. And so when a type of interaction is attempted or is something that a user wants to do with another user that falls outside of those pre-consent settings, well, then that would trigger an explicit consent exchange. Oh, this user wants to touch my virtual avatar's behind. And that falls outside of my pre-consent settings, in which case it would trigger some kind of explicit dialogue for giving agreement to that particular act. That's one feature that could be explored. Another is what our participants have called consent bubbles, these multi-stage consent bubbles. And so I need to give a little bit of background about social VR design for this to make sense. So in general purpose social VR applications today, there are these things called personal space bubbles. And so if another user were to try to enter your virtual space, this particular circle around you, they will automatically disappear. It's a way to kind of control some of that physical harassment that can occur against your avatar. Now, what's important to know about the way these features are currently designed is they're not really consent mechanics, meaning that users are not explicitly agreeing or declining invitations or attempts to enter their personal space. It's just if someone tries to enter my personal space bubble, they will disappear. And how our participants have envisioned this in the future is you can give consent quite explicitly through deliberately accepting or declining users into your personal space. So if I have a personal space bubble and someone attempts to enter that space, I could, for example, get a dialog box. Do you consent to this person entering your personal space? And the way that our participants imagine this is there would be multiple stages to these bubbles. So maybe initially I consent to this person being close enough to me that I can verbally hear what they're saying, but I don't want them to really touch me yet. And then maybe as I become more comfortable, I can accept them into the next bubble, the smaller bubble. Now I consent to them being close enough to touch my avatar. So those are some of the more popularly suggested features around consenting to an interaction occurring.
It makes sense to have that in place and then have different levels and layers where people can engage. Would that mean that the avatar or the owner of the avatar would be able to maybe even include like set questions and say, or even clearly state what their boundaries are, and then the person has to click accept before they can engage in any point? And then maybe the owner, I keep saying owner, would I say, yeah, I guess the avatar, the individual could set like a timer. If I've been speaking to somebody for 3 months, this is what I'm comfortable for them to do. And then as they hit those landmarks, but then I guess in that case, consent in 3 months' time, even if you had an idea of what you would consent to and be okay with, it's still very much an individual thing.
Right. And something that our participants across a couple of studies that we have ongoing have brought up is that users could easily have these pre-consent settings that don't actually reflect how they really want things to occur because they're just not fully imagining the nuances and types of interactions that can occur. And so I think there's still a lot of open questions as to how to implement these features in a way that doesn't inadvertently blame victims if something bad happens, like, oh, well, it's your fault for not setting that specific pre-consent rule. And so I think there's a lot of open questions still there. Our participants were focused on how do you inform consent to entering a virtual environment to begin with, and then how do you inform consent to interaction with specific users. When it comes to virtual environments, they were suggesting features like tagging or AI-generated descriptions of what is currently going on in a particular virtual reality world, especially a public one. So if there's, for example, pornography playing, or users have very sexually suggestive avatars in this particular virtual environment, I might want to avoid that. So I can make an informed decision to not consent to observing those experiences. When it comes to informing consent to interaction, this is where we get into some controversial ideas, because some of them have some fairly significant flaws. So what we've heard very consistently is that users want information about their potential interaction partners before consenting to interacting with them. And this goes back to what we were talking about before around anonymity and authenticity. And so some of the things that have been suggested to us, especially by women, is this idea of risk flags or a rating system where other women can give an indication of whether a particular user has a tendency to engage in non-consensual acts or harassing behavior that other women can then be informed about to help them make a decision of whether I want to accept this person into my consent bubble, for example. Now, the reason that's very controversial is because these kinds of features would seem highly susceptible to abuse or bias. For example, this person rejected me as a romantic partner, so I'm going to submit an erroneous report that they've verbally harassed or assaulted my avatar. And so I'm very hesitant to give any confident recommendations around design patterns for informing consent to interaction, given some of these issues.
Yeah, I could, as you were saying that, I could see how that could definitely become an issue, because it could be weaponized, unfortunately, which then is not fair for those who need or turn to that tool to be able to help them. When we were talking about the consent, you talked about the potential for the individual to like watch the avatar. So could, like, let's say another person makes a request to want to engage with an individual, And instead of saying yes straight away, let's say, for example, me, I could say, I would like to observe the person's behavior on the platform for a period of time and then make my decision. Is that what that would look like?
Okay, that's an interesting interpretation. That's not where I was going. So in terms of observation, we're talking about in public VR spaces, consenting to observing interactions that other users are engaging in. So for example, I go into a virtual world and there are, let's say it's a virtual bar, and there are other avatars nearby that are pretty clearly engaging in cybersexual acts, some heavy groping of a virtual avatar, or maybe someone or a group of people have their avatars designed to be almost nude. They're nude looking avatars. And users that enter these virtual spaces, they might not consent to that kind of observation. They might find it too graphic or re-traumatizing if it reminds them of a particular experience they've had in the past. And so when we're talking about consent to observation, we're talking about getting users explicit agreement to observing particular types of behavior before that observation actually happens.
I understand. Okay, interesting. We've covered, I say you have covered several different aspects of metaverse dating. And I just want to kind of bring it together because there might be people listening, some of our listeners might be listening thinking, okay, I've never heard of metaverse dating, but I do engage in some form of virtual activities. So maybe I could give this a try. So I guess if you could just sum up what are the potential advantages as well as disadvantages of using the metaverse for finding love, finding connection compared to traditional dating methods.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of advantages, even though it sounds like I'm only talking about the disadvantages. But in terms of advantages, one of the biggest ones is the capacity to avoid harm if you can be having dates completely virtually that give you that same sense of compatibility and chemistry as you would face-to-face. If you can have those before meeting face-to-face, you can sidestep a lot of those physical risks of harm. In terms of the disadvantages, there of course is the capacity for inaccurate impressions, potential dating partners based on the limitations we have to avatar design and other forms of expression. And of course, there are the unique harms that users can be exposed to within VR as well. And so I think that's going to be a careful balancing act as we go forward over the next few years.
And what advice would you give to somebody who is now, okay, they've received the information, they've absorbed it, and now they say, I want to use the metaverse for dating and relationships? What would be your advice and like first steps? Which apps to go on, if you can even recommend? I'm not asking for myself, or maybe I am.
Oh, in terms of recommendations, the first one would be just to be careful. The second is to recognize that harm that occurs in this space is not always deliberate. One of the things that has really struck me about our prior work is users who will describe to us experiences where it becomes very clear they have committed harm themselves or engaged in an act where consent was not clearly conveyed, and they describe the situation almost in a bragging light as if it was a dating success. And so I'd really urge users to consider the impacts of their own behavior and how they are, especially in a VR environment, how they are understanding agreement and consent of their partners to particular acts, and if those strategies that they're engaging in could be susceptible to misinterpretation. The third would be to keep in mind that there are no objective rules for how to define harm in VR dating and even in physical world dating. And if there's an experience that a user is engaged in that doesn't feel right to them or that makes them feel uncomfortable, then the behavior is wrong because of that. Too often we've seen in our past work, people that we would qualify as victims of sexual violence describe allowing the behavior to happen, and in some cases even apologizing to the perpetrator because they think that behavior is normal and expected within the online dating process. This is particularly prevalent with acts of sexual harassment and sexual solicitations. And so if there's a behavior that someone's engaging in or experiencing that they don't like or that they don't appreciate, then it is wrong purely on that definition.
Wow. Thank you so much. You've really added a different dimension and a different take on love in the digital age. I'm really glad to have been able to speak to you and hear so much about your research and the current state of play and understanding, and particularly talking about consent in this space. Before I let you go, if you could leave us with some take-home messages from everything that you've spoken about today.
Yes. Okay. So instead of messages, I would leave our listeners with some questions, given how we are in these very formative stages of VR dating and dating in the metaverse. One is, how can we design VR dating applications for safety? And I'm not talking about having some user guidelines. I'm not talking about terms of service. I'm talking about fundamentally designing the application and the features and structures within them for safety of users. How can we do that? And the other question I have is, and related to that is, how can we design consent? So there's a lot of talk about how we practice consent. Yes means yes, and no means no. But how can we design the metaverse to scaffold the way that we exchange consent in a way that minimizes misinterpretation of agreement and sexual harm from occurring? The third is, how can we design mixed reality dating applications? So we're seeing these early attempts at VR dating, but as I was saying before, we see this conspicuous absence of applications or features intended for use during a face-to-face encounter. And I think mixed reality gives us some very interesting opportunities there to scaffold that experience through augmented reality and then into virtual reality and so forth. So those are the three questions I would leave. And I would also remind readers that if they're interested in any of the ideas for designing for consent that I have very hastily mentioned in this interview, we do have work coming out in IEEE transactions on visualization and computer graphics in the next couple months. So be on the lookout for that. I'll also be presenting at IEEE VR for this work in a couple months as well.
And when the paper has been published, please do send me a link so that I can update everyone on your findings. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much and lots to think about. It's just a whole different world that I've learned about, which is a little bit overwhelming, but in a good way. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll have you again on the podcast to give us a follow-up on your work and everything that you're doing in this space.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was a lot of fun, even though some of the stuff we talked about wasn't too much fun. But I hope it's of value to you and your listeners.
Definitely.
You've been listening to the Monday Science Podcast, a weekly show bringing you the latest research and news in science, technology, medicine, and health. We hope you've gotten some useful and thought-provoking info from the show, and we hope you had fun along the way. We know we did. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hook up with us on our website at www.mondaysciencepodcast.com. Shoot us an email at info@mondaysciencepodcast.com. Find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Monday Science, and access episode summaries at mondayscience.medium.com. See you next week on the Monday Science Podcast.